You know what our ramper's thinking right about now? She's thinking the same thing that everybody else in eyeshot of this vintage DC-6 is thinking. I bet they're not going to be able to get it started. And you know what the most embarrassing thing in the world is? Not being able to get it started. But don't you worry, I'm here to help. Welcome aboard, everybody. It's Rob from PMDG, and this time I mean it. Let's get started. Alright, well, welcome back to the flight deck of the PMDG DC-6. This tutorial is going to be about engine starts. Now, a couple things I want to make clear. There's really going to be two tutorials about engine starts. There's going to be this one, which is just going to cover the basics of how do you get the engine started. But I'm also going to do an advanced tutorial that really covers the inside nitty-gritty, in-deep, get oil on your hands kind of aspects of how to start and keep a radial engine running once you've got it started. Now, I've been flying radial engine airplanes for just about 20 years now. I've got a significant amount of experience flying the DC-3 and operating those engines. Some of the tips and tricks that I'm going to teach you in this tutorial and in the advanced tutorial come from that experience, and they're adapted in order to make your simulator experience a little bit more enjoyable. There's nothing more frustrating than getting into our DC-6, for example, and just simply not being able to get the engine started because you don't really understand the goal. So I'm going to walk you through that. This tutorial, we're going to stick right down the middle of this is what you do to get the engine started and keep them running. At the end of the tutorial, I'm going to give you a couple of tricks that if the engines won't start, look here, look here, look here, this is what you're looking for. My hope is it'll make engine starts less of a mystery and give you some more success. So there's three things you need to start a radial engine. You need air, which will take care of itself. You need fuel, which you're going to have to introduce, and you need a spark, which will come from the ignition system. I'm going to show you how to manipulate the switches in order to bring all three of those things together in order to get your engine started. I'm going to take you through three views you're going to use during the engine start. Obviously, you've got the view of your overhead panel. This is button 6 in our view definition. Next, we're going to hit button 2. This is your engine instruments. Button 5 is your flight engineer's view that shows you the back of the pedestal. Now these are your mixture levers. These control whether or not your engines can get fuel. Up here, important stuff you want to be looking at is fuel pressure and oil pressure. Also, once you get your engine running, you're going to want to be looking at RPM. On the overhead panel, switches you're going to be using, these are your fuel pumps up here. These are your starter switches. You've got your engine start selector, and you've got your ignition switches. That pretty much covers everything you're going to need to get an engine started. Now, these ignition switches, I may refer to them as magnetos because that's what we call them in the Warbird community. Those switches are determining whether or not there's electricity going to the spark plugs in the cylinder of the engine. So a whole complicated topic related to that we'll go into in the advanced tutorial. For now, what you want to do is rotate those to the both position when you're trying to start an engine. By doing that, you'll be sending electricity to both spark plugs in every cylinder on that engine, and that's really what you want. All right, right here we've got our start switches. There's a safety switch and a start switch. They move together. Once you close these two switches, the engine will start to rotate, and your flight engineer will begin calling out blades. He'll count through 12. The reason he's doing that is not to disperse lubricant inside the engine, as many people believe. It's a process that's used to check and ensure that the engine does not have a hydraulic lock with oil or fuel trapped inside of a cylinder. This switch right here is your booster switch. This is an ignition booster, and it will confuse some people because up here in the fuel pumps you've got a fuel booster pump, so people see booster on the pump and they see booster on the switch and they think, well, they must be related. Well, they're not. The booster switch is actually related to an ignition coil that that dramatically increases the number of or the amount of ignition sparking going on from the spark plugs. It's sort of colloquially referred to as a shower of sparks. The hope is that by using the booster coil to increase the amount of ignition, that a spark floating through the cylinder that's all full of fuel vapor is going to meet a happy fuel vapor. They'll meet, there'll be some chemistry, boom, and that engine's going to light off. So that's what that booster is doing. On the other side of this group of switches, we have a prime switch. Now, you'll have a boost pump on, and that boost pump is going to provide fuel under pressure from the tank to the engine. When you press this prime switch, it's going to open a valve which will then allow that fuel to go down through the carburetor, through the intake valves, into the cylinder, where, if we're lucky, it meets our happy little spark and the aforementioned boom, and everybody lives happily ever after. That prime switch is how you're going to introduce fuel to the engine during the start to make sure that it gets up and running. And you'll do that in a very specific order with these 4 switches that we're looking at right here. But there's another very important component to providing fuel to the engine so that it can run. And that component comes through the fuel mixture levers, which are down on the back side of the throttle pedestal down here. These 4 levers with an M on them are your mixture levers. And these are, if you've flown general aviation airplanes, you're already familiar with them. They're very similar, except that we have a very sophisticated, automated, mechanically driven fuel computer that meters the fuel to the engine. But you see it's got an idle cutoff position. When the levers are in this position, the engine's not getting any fuel. Pretty self-explanatory. Auto lean position. This is the position that this lever will be in at low power settings, like taxiing on the ground or during cruise flight. Then the auto rich position, which is up above it, that's the position you'll want the lever in when you're operating at high power, such as during takeoff or a climb or even a go-around, something like that. To move the switches is pretty straightforward. I recommend you just hover your mouse over it. Use the center scroll button. Scroll forward 1, it'll move up. Scroll forward back, it'll move down. Really not hard to remember to do, and it sort of matches the kinesthetic feel of what you're doing with that lever. Alright, so let's roll right into a start here. Now, let's have our automatic flight engineer do the before start check. That way we know everything's all set up properly. If there's one thing that I could impart to you that will make things easier for you as you fly the DC-6, use the automatic flight engineer. We spent a lot of time creating his logic in order to automate a bunch of tasks that might require you to really dig into the manuals and get deep down into the dirt and learn the whole airplane. And we've simulated all of that. This is an incredibly complex simulation of a vintage airliner. But we didn't want to put you in a position where you had to learn all this stuff. So use the flight engineer to simplify your life, to unload some tasks, ensure you succeed with things, and then start taking pieces of that operation away from him one at a time. You can do the whole pre-flight setup and go through the engine start, or you can do the after start checklists and things of that nature. That would be my recommendation for how to kind of work your way into flying the DC-6. I often like to say with the crews that I fly, you don't have to eat the whole cookie at once. Sometimes it's good to just sort of nibble around the edges. So let's see them wrap up this checklist, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Before start checks complete.
Alright, with that, we're ready to start. Are you nervous? Don't be. I'm the only one that's going to laugh at you. Alright, so you'll notice that the flight engineer pushed the mixture up for us. He also set the number 3 engine igniter to on and set the engine selector to the number 3 position. All that's left for us to do, turn the boost pump on, click the starters, click the booster coil, click the primer after he counts for 12 blades. So, let's go ahead and turn the boost pump on. Now, this is an important verification step. Slide down here to view number 2, look at the number 3 engine fuel pressure. You see you've got fuel pressure there. So, hit the starter, he's going to count 12 blades.
6, 9, Then we're going to hit the booster coil. Now we're going to hit the primer. And there we go. Congratulations. You've started your first radial engine. But important, jump down here to the number 2 view, looking at the instruments, and make sure you get oil pressure. If you don't get oil pressure within 30 seconds, that engine's going to eat itself, so shut it down. Now over here, you'll notice that the RPM is fairly high. Just wiggle the throttle a little bit, pull it back to idle, so that engine settles in below 1,000 RPM. That's where it should normally go after a start. You want to do that because you really don't want to run a radial engine above 1,000 RPM until the engine oil's had a chance to heat to at least 40 degrees Celsius. That is, generally speaking, a very good way to ensure that you get unnecessary wear on the bearings, and that'll come back to bite you later. And engines never fail in cruise, they always fail on takeoff for some reason. So anyway, all right, so you can see our ramper is she doesn't appear impressed. She's definitely not impressed. All right, she knows we got 3 more chances to mess this up, so let's go ahead and get started. Next engine to start is going to be number 4. So bring the number 4 mixture lever up. Now we bounce back up here to the overhead panel. We set the igniter to on, or excuse me, to both. Move the engine selector to number 4. Turn the number 4 boost pump on to low is fine. I accidentally set it to high there, but I just moved it back to low. You can see we've got fuel pressure in the number 4 engine right over here. That's what you want. Back to the overhead panel. Hit those starters. Let the AFE count out blades.
6, 9,
Gets 12. Hit the boost. Hit the primer. Boom. Engine lights off. You've now got 2 engines running. Okay. Immediately use view number 2. Go right down to the engine instruments. Look at your oil pressure. Look at your fuel pressure. Check your RPM for number 4. Make sure it's down below 1,000 RPM, so that's all good. You got a nice, clean, healthy start out of it. One of the things I'm really looking forward to is when Asobo gives us the ability to add smoke emitters to our DC-6. That's really going to make these engine starts even more fun. Alright, let's start engine number 2. Number 2 ignition to both. Set the engine selector to number 2. We're going to turn the number 2 boost pump to low. Hit the starter.
3,
AFE counts out 12 blades.
6, 9, 12.
Boost. Primer. Voila. Engine lights off. We jump down to the main panel view. We're checking for fuel pressure, oil pressure, RPM. And you'll notice the whole panel's got a nice pleasant little shake to it. That's actually a very realistic representation of the vibration that these engines will put into the airframe when they're at low power. One more engine to start, so bring the number 1 engine mixture up, turn the number 1 igniters on, set the engine selector to 1, boost pump to low pressure, hit the starter, engine's turning over.
3,
When you get good at this, on this one you
6,
lean over and look out the window and you can see it turning. It's
5,
pretty cool. 12
12.
blades and boost, primer. Okay. Jump down here, check your oil pressure, check your fuel pressure, check your RPM. You now have 4 good engines lit off. Now just take a glance across. You'll notice that your gauges here all pretty much line up. Here you get your fuel flow, those match. Now you'll notice on your oil pressure gauges that the engine you started first has the lowest oil pressure. And if you think about it, it makes sense because that engine's been heating up its oil a lot longer than the other 3. You'll notice that a warm engine has lower oil pressure than a cold engine, and that's reflected in these gauges here. You can see the oil temperature of the first engine we started is higher than the last engine. And you'll notice also that as the oil warms, the cylinder head temperatures here are going to climb, and the RPM will kind of creep forward. So if you're in a cold climate when you start these engines, you're going to bring the RPMs back, and then they're going to tend to creep forward. You're going to be constantly pulling the throttles back to keep the engines from going over 1,000 RPM while the engine oil warms. That's a realistic representation of what it's like. Now, it's always important to do the after start checklist.
Off and off. Battery switch. Plane
You can
battery.
see that they're going through and
Generator
doing some
fan
switch
burst.
cleanup and making sure things
Check
are all
and
set.
on. Emergency lights. Armed. Ground power. Removed. After start checks complete.
Okay. Alright, I think I detect a tiny little bit of a smile on your face, and that's good. Starting at DC-6 is really not terribly difficult once you kind of have the switchology down, know which buttons to hit and which switches to throw in the right order. And of course, relying upon the automated flight engineer to then do the setup and then also do the cleanup afterwards really does simplify your life. Now, let's check on our ramp agent here and see if she's thoroughly impressed at the fact that we did manage to get it started. And yeah, I'm not seeing it. Okay, anyway. Something that you will want to spend a little bit of time watching is your engine instrumentation while your engines are warming up. Oil temperature is very important to radial engines, and when you first get them started, if it's cold out, give them an opportunity to warm up before you start applying power to them. Otherwise, they're going to wear prematurely, and you really don't want that because that gets expensive. Okay, so I've reset us. We're now in a ship that is on ground power but is completely shut down. And what we're going to do is we're going to use engine number 2 to demonstrate a couple of different failure modes you might run into. Alright, ship's all ready to start. Just reach up here, we crank the starter. Nothing happens. You can tell because our ramp agent continues to be unimpressed. The first thing you should suspect if that happens is your engine selector right here. Chances are you probably left it in the off position, and that's why your engine won't rotate. The other gotcha is if you've just started, say, engine number 3, and now you want to start engine number 4, but you forgot to move the selector and you can't figure out why engine 4 is not turning, that's probably why. Alright, so let's continue on. We've now set it to engine number 2, and we're preparing to start engine number 2. So we hit the starter,
3,
we can hear the engines turning.
6,
We wait till our
9,
flight engineer counts our 12 blades. We
12.
add boost, we add prime, and ignition. Nothing. It just continues to rotate. Okay. If you've got an engine that rotates and you know your ignition's working, chances are you forgot the fuel. So you glance down here, you see, oh, look at that. No fuel pressure. Okay. So we've got to fix the fuel pressure problem going to the engine. Yeah, all right. Let's bring the mixture lever up and turn the boost pump on. And if we glance down here, yep, look at that. We have fuel pressure. All right, so see? It's easy to solve these problems if you just think about the fact that you need those 3 things. Because
3,
if you've got air, you've got fuel, and
6,
you've got spark, you're going to have an engine
5,
light off. As we're going to see
12.
right here. Look at that. So troubleshooting them is not terribly difficult. You just got to kind of stop, think it through, suspect that engine selector, suspect your ignition. And if you've got those taken care of, then look at your fuel. If you got that taken care of, well, then you're probably going to be calling maintenance. But, let's see here. So, let's light off another one. We'll do number 1 this time. Get fuel in. Yeah, we'll crank that starter. You can see that our engine selector is on number 1. When the
6,
flight engineer gets to 12 blades, all we
9,
got to do is
12.
boost, hit the prime, it's not lighting off. Now why do you think that is? We got air. We know we've got fuel. But let's maybe just go take a look anyway. Yep, we do have fuel pressure. So, we know we've got air, we know we've got fuel. Oh, spark. See? Our igniter's still off. that means we're not getting the spark to the engine to light it off. So we're going to have to add that in order to get this engine to start. That's how the troubleshooting process should work for you. Just think it through. Now, you'll notice in the tablet that we have both a realistic engine start and a simplified engine start. If you're having trouble starting the engines, turn off the realistic engine start until you get the hang of it. That will widen out the parameters by which the engine will start, and that'll make your life a little bit easier, and then turn it back on once you get good at it. Alright, well, I think we're pretty much ready to start looking at taxiing and flying. So, till next time, fly safely, be good to one another, thank you for flying PMDG, and see you again real soon.